Thank you. Is the sound okay? Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. What a great honor to be invited here again. Actually, the team from Saltmarsh have been inviting me for 5 years in a row, and I haven't been able to come back. This is the proof that I was here 5 years ago, so it's great to be here. So, lots of things have changed in my life, as you can imagine. The first of all being these things. I have to start wearing every so often these things. I didn't have to. So it basically brought us a little bit as well into the subject of accessibility. Because we are storytellers, thanks Scott, I'm going to start this talk with a story. And this story took place with somebody who you all know very well. Those who actually came to this conference the previous years have met Daniel Steinberg. He's a great speaker, a great friend of mine. I have been tremendously honored to be a part of a troupe of developers touring around Europe at some point in 2010 to talk about the iPhone and the iPad. These were very big new things back then. Right now they're very established, very enterprise even sometimes, depending on how you look at them. And we were touring around Europe, and we arrived in London in 2010, right in the middle of the World Cup. So it's not the best time of the year to make a conference, a football World Cup, but still, I was giving a session that maybe some of you who might have came here in 2011 might remember. I was talking about 10 commandments for iOS development, right? So I was saying things that you should or should not do whenever writing your projects. And as I was, wrapping up, I finished my talk. It went well, if I remember well. I was packing up, and it was like, this is cables and the adapters and the whole thing in my bag. And all of a sudden, I hear somebody behind me, you forgot one commandment. And I'm like, okay, the adapter, oh, really? Oh, what commandment did I forget? Because I wasn't finding my adapters and the whole thing. You know how MS could be. And he tells me something very important. You forgot one commandment, which is to make apps accessible. And I remember that as I was packing, and a coin drops all of a sudden. I'm like, what? And sorry. And this is pretty much the face I made. I raised my eyes, and the person who made this comment to me was blind, completely and utterly blind. He was holding his cane. He was accompanied together with a colleague of his, and they were attending this session. He was an iPhone developer as well, and he proceeded to show me how to use Voiceover. The 10 minutes that followed, those 10 minutes where I watched this person, a completely blind person, using his iPhone and showing me how he could manage open apps, create events in the calendar, send a tweet, answer an email. It was quite an enlightening moment for me. I realized how much these devices mean to these people. For this guy, this iPhone was a means of communication with the world that went beyond what we can describe with words. He could approach the world in a way that somehow this iPhone had become part of his eyes, or actually his eyes, in a complete sense of the word. So I started at that point talking to people around me, because this was a very strong anecdote, and I was telling developers. And I decided to make this talk, and actually this is the first time I give this talk. I've been advocating accessibility in all of my projects and trying to get managers and developers to pay attention to the theme of accessibility. At the same time, when we have the immense fortune of having all of our bodily functions in place and be able to enjoy the world with all of our senses, we just do not measure the tremendous effort that it means to be in the world when you have a disability. And this talk is a call to action. I want all of you guys who are here to feel the same way of enlightenment that I felt. I hope I can transmit this. and that you are going to go to your teams and make your apps accessible. And I'm going to start this talk with the questions that I asked myself back in the time. It's like, well, okay, what is accessibility? And what does iOS have to offer in that respect? I had never paid attention to the accessibility tab in the settings app of the iPhone. Actually, I have barely opened it maybe. So it was a very interesting trip, and it took me to actually figure out what are disabilities. Okay, what are disabilities? What kind of problems can a human have when moving around in the world? And it turns out that the World Health Organization has an official definition for disability. And disabilities are kind of an umbrella term that defines three types of situations, which are impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. These are three things. It's a very broad definition of disability. And we are going to see how much this broad definition is useful for us to understand what we have to do in our apps. I started wondering, okay, how many people in the world have disabilities? It turns out that there's 1 billion people in the world with disabilities, as defined by the World Health Organization. That is 15% of mankind, depending on who you ask, but pretty much it's the same number. 2% of which have severe disabilities. We are talking about really complete blindness, impossibility to walk, or learning disorders of many types. And the American census specifies that 20% of Americans suffer from some kind of disability. These are huge numbers. By any sense, somehow it surprised me. I didn't think it was that many people. Particularly vision impairment. I mean, iPhones and iPads and iOS in general is such a visual environment that vision impairment is a very strong part of our learning about disabilities and accessibility. And I found out that 285 million people are estimated to have vision impairments of any kind. And in particular, color blindness. I was surprised of the numbers. Caucasian men and women have a very high rate, relatively high rate of color blindness. These numbers are for the Caucasian ethnic group, so different ethnic groups might have different ratios. But apparently, 1 out of 12 men has vision disabilities, color blindness. That means that when you walk on the street, when you look at your neighbors, there's a very high probability that many of these people have color blindness. Any of you have color blindness? Maybe? Some of you right here? No? There we go. You. There you go. So, see, it's Caucasians. That's the problem. But seriously, very interesting thing to understand as well that disabilities per se are not a barrier. The barrier is society. Society builds biases against disabilities. And the strongest demonstration of how disabilities are not a barrier are the Paralympics that were happening right now, these days in Rio, and of which India has had a very strong contender, bringing back gold medals for the first time in India. This is a huge achievement for India as well. So disabilities are definitely not the barrier. Turns out that the UN has taken the concept of disabilities to actually build a chart, a convention of rights for people with disabilities. The first article of which states the objective of this chart is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all people with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. It's a very high aim, and I think worthy of followership and worthy of praise. These are all the countries that have signed the chart. As you can see, most of the countries have signed, apart from Somalia and other states, maybe Zimbabwe. And the lighter green are the ones that have not yet ratified it internally in their countries. So as usual, Belarus, North Korea, and America are a bit lacking in that respect, unfortunately. There are 8 guiding principles for this convention and this chart of rights for disabled people, the 6th of which is accessibility, very interestingly. And now we close the loop and we understand the relationship. Accessibility is the degree to which a product, a service, or an environment, a place, just like this room, is accessible to people of all kinds. And this is very important. Accessibility is not usability. It's commonly mixed terms. Things can be accessible but completely unusable. That can be it's a totally different concept, of course. However, accessibility is not only about disability, because accessibility is about everyone. Accessibility is about gender inclusion. Accessibility is about religious inclusion. Accessibility is about disabilities, of course, as well, but not only. And I think India, because of your multiculturality, is a place that is naturally suited for a talk like accessibility. Somehow I was very, very happy to talk about this subject right here. So let us talk about some examples in real life about accessibility or lack thereof. I found a very interesting article about accessibility in conferences. There's a conference where, for example, happening in the United States, a Ruby on Rails conference, where there was a person reading in sign language, speaking in sign language together with the speaker, so that not blind people, for that deaf people to be able to follow what was being said. Some cities are designed to be accessible, but they're not. This is an article that I read on medium.com about a woman on a wheelchair moving around New York, and unfortunately reporting that, for example, Uber drivers who have to mandatorily follow a course on accessibility somehow lacked the empathy, and was actually, apparently her driver was actually complaining that he had to follow a course on disability to a disabled woman, which is actually not only of bad taste, but actually a very unfortunate event. Opla. Well, you can make apps with the diverse team. Apple has hired internally blind developers, deaf developers, who work in their teams for the accessibility features. They also work in the testing teams to provide information to the developers of whether the accessibility features work or not. This is very interesting, and it speaks a lot about the internal culture of the company. Apple sells on the store products for disabled users. One of the most wonderful of them, the one that actually was most incredible to me, was a product for deaf blind users. They can actually read the screen, putting their hands on a Braille reader that will read in Braille to their fingers whatever is on the screen, because they cannot hear, and it also allows them to type on a small screen that translates back everything into Unicode text that reading users can read. This is really wonderful, and the interface is over Bluetooth using the standard frameworks that we use and love in iOS. So my call to you, and we are going to go through a small demo as well to show you a little bit of what can be done in terms of accessibility, is to make accessible apps. How? That is a big question. And first of all, you got to know that the iOS brings accessibility features for all 4 kinds of accessibility issues that can be grouped into motor accessibility. So if you have trouble moving, or you suffer from Parkinson and you have trouble using your mobile device, there are helper controls on the screen, like the Assistive Touch and the switch control, that allow you to navigate and manipulate the applications using very big controls on the screen. I'm going to show Assistive Touch in a minute. If you have vision problems, you start to use features like dynamic type, or zoom, or zooming the screen, or the magnifier in iOS 10, or the voiceover feature that I'm also going to display to show, and this is the one that this person in London was using in front of me. If you have hearing problems, you can have LED flash for your alerts. Every time you receive a notification, every time something happens on the screen, you have the LED flashing to you. So that gives you an idea that something is happening worthy of your attention. And if you have problems using in terms of dyslexia or other learning problems, you can use guided access to restrict your use of the device to a particular set of apps that helps you learn and use these devices more effectively. You have to, when you think about accessibility, it's not only about development. So I understand most of you are developers, but you most probably work with UX designers, UI designers, you work with testers as well. The accessibility mindset has to permeate the whole environment of development. This is very, very, very important, and it has to go from design through development to testing. When you're working in UX design, design your personas and your use cases with accessibility in mind. Whenever you design a new feature, saying, wait a second, what happens if the user is blind? What are the cues? How will it work for hearing impaired users? Think about your features, how they should be used, and if you can, include people with disabilities in your teams so that they can help you through this process as well. If you do UI design, I'm going to stop into UI design for a little while. There are 4 aspects to take attention to when you're working on accessibility features: typography, layouts, colors, and iconography. Typography, pay attention to hierarchy. When you create your text, when you lay your text on the screen, there are titles, bodies, headlines, call-outs. These different things have different semantics. So pay attention to this, because typography is a great way to convey hierarchy. Pay attention to the languages as well. It's not the same to display text in Hebrew or Arabic than in English or German, because they are written on a different sense, and by such your layout will change. As well, German requires much more space than English or Spanish, and if you are displaying text in Vietnamese, you are going to have diacritic signs above and below the baselines, and that creates tremendous problems as well. The layout of your text will dramatically change. So one simple clue is to stick to the standard fonts as long as possible. Standard fonts by Apple, provided in iOS, they solve many of these problems already. If you choose a custom font because you need it, because of branding, pay attention to these issues. And finally, a very simple trick: bigger lines are better. Of course, you can show less text on the screen, but bigger lines makes text easier to read, easier to follow, and it helps you with diacritic signs in many languages. When you lay out the UI of your code, auto layout and dynamic type are your friend. Dynamic type, how many of you use dynamic type right now? How you configure dynamic type? Dynamic type, very good. How many of you have baked dynamic type in your apps? There you go. We're going to see that in the demo, because that is a super important fact, and I'm actually starting to choose apps depending on dynamic type as well. Apple provides a dynamic type size table. Dynamic type, by the way, it's a very bad name for a technology. As much as I love Apple, the name dynamic type, when you look for dynamic type, you get references to Objective-C, because Objective-C is a dynamically typed language, and there you go. It all goes down from there. Not a good name for a technology, in my opinion. However, if you are creating apps, and you specify your text in the application to belong to some of these families, iOS will take care of the resizing automatically for you. So it's a good option and a good idea to stick to this. In terms of color, the biggest problem is culture, of course. Green in China means a different thing as, for example, the Arabic countries consider green to be a religious color that is revered and respected. In European cultures, it might mean ecology. Red in China means good luck. In the Western world, red is usually blood. So there are cultural differences here. And very important, one thing that I always do whenever I receive a new design for an application is to set up the screens in grayscale. And that gives you an idea of sometimes, unfortunately, how bad some designers create hierarchies using color. And whenever you are looking at the world on a grayscale screen, it just doesn't work anymore, okay? In my opinion, whenever your hierarchy and your design works on grayscale, it usually works very well in other contexts. Finally, iconography, very important. If you're going to be inclusive, if you want to enable accessibility to as many groups of people as possible, to as many cultures as possible, pay attention. Different gestures of your hand, I'm not going to show which, have different meanings in different cultures. There's the typical case of the English sign for victory, which if you turn your hand around, which I'm not going to do, really means something else. So pay attention to these cultural differences. It's actually something that is not immediately obvious, but it makes a difference. Iconography conveys semantics. We get to the interesting part, development. This is the part that we all like, right? So you can add accessibility information in two different ways in your app, both in Xcode, of course. One is through code, the other one is through Interface Builder. And both work with the same underlying protocol called UI accessibility. There's a protocol called UI accessibility that basically asks each one of the widgets in your application 4 separate questions. The first question is, are you accessible? If you are accessible, then what are you? Who are you? What's your name? And then where are you? The UI accessibility protocol has 4 basic properties. It contains much more, but these are the basic 4. Is accessibility element returns a Boolean. If you return true to this, and I hope you do, you are going to be asked your traits. That explains what are you? Are you a button? Are you static text? What are you? Then the accessibility label. What is your name? Who are you? Oh, I'm the title label. I'm the name label. I'm the phone number text field. Okay, there you go. And accessibility frame. Where are you on the screen? What is your frame? And that usually is the frame, the normal frame of the object. There's a lot of different traits. So here I'm showing both in code and in Interface Builder how you can set these different traits. These traits are a bit mask. You can have many of them, just as you can check several checkboxes at the same time. Internationalization is a big concept. So basically, I was going to include as well a little bit of a discussion about internationalization because it is part of accessibility. In my opinion, accessibility is a very, very big topic. But internalization per se, there's a lot of tools provided in iOS. So I'm going to leave you to go to check Laura's talk in the SD Hall tomorrow at 10:50. She will talk about this subject in great detail. Finally, testing, the final part of your development process, testing. The good news about testing is that once that you've added your accessibility information to your UI, you can use UI testing directly from Xcode because the UI testing from Xcode uses the accessibility information to find the different elements on the screen, to activate them, to navigate through your application. So a side effect of adding accessibility features to your app is that actually you're enabling UI testing. So everybody wins when you do accessibility in your iOS app. If you're not much into testing, I figured out that maybe some of you haven't written unit tests or aren't very familiar with the concept. There's a testing session right after today, right after lunch. So please go check it out, even if it's in Android. But I think testing, most of the testing, unit testing systems in particular, are mostly very similar between platforms. So now let's go to the demo. And I will invoke the demo gods to help me in this session, so I hope it works. So I have many microphones here. Oh, okay, well, so I am going to go now. So here I have this movie that I have here. It's not a movie. I'm just mirroring my iPhone right here. So this is my iPhone, and here, I will walk you through 2 different things. First of all, I am going to show some accessibility features in iOS. Secondly, I've built a very quick, small application that we're going to fix together to add accessibility features. So it doesn't have almost none of them, and by the end of the session, I hope it will be much, much better. So if the demo gods are with me, we can start. I am going to go first on my iPhone. I will open the settings application on your iPhone. You can follow together with me if you want. And in the General tab, there's an accessibility sub-item where you have different options for accessibility. I'm just going to mention some of them. First of all, I'm going to mention very quickly the Magnifier. This is new in iOS 10. I think it's an awesome feature. So once you enable it, you have to triple tap on the home button. And this brings a magnifier. So here I'm pointing to my keyboard, and I'm going to zoom in. As you can see, it is quite cool. I can see a lot of detail, and there's an autofocus and everything for you. So it's kind of cool. I think it's a very nice feature that they added. Another thing that can be useful to users with mobility limitations is the Assistive Touch. The Assistive Touch feature enables a small button that appears on your screen. You can move the location of the button to wherever you want, and this opens up a small menu that actually allows you to operate the iPhone directly from the screen. So for example, you can invoke the home button directly from here. You can go to device, multitasking, and then you can select the application where you were previously, and you can even lock the screen directly from the device without touching the wake button. So in my case, I had in the past an iPhone that got, I live in Switzerland, so I always have chocolate in my pockets, and these days I put the iPhone in the same pocket as a chocolate, so the wake button got stuck with chocolate. I kid you not, this is exactly a true story. So I couldn't use my wake button anymore for an old iPhone I had, and I had to use this for months, and actually it works pretty well. It gives you a fair amount of control, and it helps you find hidden features that you should, for many of them, you should probably triple click the home button or swipe in, swipe out. These kind of gestures can be complicated, particularly for elderly people. Hello? And that can help. So this is Assistive Touch. Of course, the most tremendously incredible feature of accessibility is VoiceOver. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on it because it's quite incredible. So I'm going to enable it just by clicking VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on. Settings. Accessibility. Back button.
So VoiceOver speaks to me anything that my finger rests upon. So right now I'm going to look at you. I'm not going to look at my screen, and I'm going to try to find out my way and to see what's going on directly from here. So I'm going to double click on the home button.
App switcher. VoiceOver. Music. Active.
And it tells me that the first application is music because I was using the music application a couple of minutes ago. And I can select
music.
The music application.
Back button. App switcher. Settings. Active.
So I'm trying to go back now to
settings.
settings.
With 3 fingers to close the app.
So I have to double tap.
Accessibility. Back button.
There we go. I have to double tap on anything to activate it, while I tap only once to have the screen read to me.
VoiceOver on. VoiceOver speaks items on the screen. Tap once to select an item. Swipe 3 fingers to scroll.
And whenever I'm scrolling my finger on top of something that doesn't have any information, this is what I hear, a small ting, ting, ting on the screen. Good, so this is a small walkthrough of VoiceOver. I'm going to come back to VoiceOver a little bit later. For a moment, I'm just going
on. VoiceOver off.
To deactivate it, okay? And I'm going to show you the application that I have built for this demo. And this is a very simple application. As you can see, it couldn't be simpler. It's a master detail application. I'm showing just some data stored inside of a JSON file. Nothing groundbreaking. I'm just going to launch it, so that you can see it. This is Xcode 8, and I wrote the application on Swift 3, which, by the way, I think is the first actual production version of Swift ever. So as you can see, I can run my application right here. It displays a list of customers, whatever, could be people, contacts, and then when you select one of the contacts, you have basically the details of that contact. And the most interesting feature about the application in the sense of usability is that there is a small kind of validation. So whenever a field is empty, the corresponding label will be shown in red. Very basic. There's nothing else than that. This control right here is just a custom control that I built. It's a subclass of UI control. I'm going to show you the source code. It's not even 10 or 15 lines long, very, very simple. And let's see if we can use this application using VoiceOver, shall we? So I'm going to launch the application on the iPhone this time.
VoiceOver on. Settings.
So I've
accessibility. Back button.
I've enabled accessibility on my VoiceOver on my iPhone. I select my device. The Cosma is the name of my device. And I will launch the application on my iPhone. There we go. So this is the application.
Accessible.
This is the application running on my iPhone. And if I move my finger over the contacts,
Kamiko Q. Clark. 8 4 3 3 6 7 8. Luctus. Kermit. Hannah U. Howard. App number 9.
It's kind of cumbersome.
83. Hannah U. Howard. Customers. Customers. Custom.
So it's kind of cumbersome because the thing is reading everything on every label that it finds. But it's okay, it does its job somehow. And then I can select an item. Let's say Kameko Clark.
Kamiko Q. Clark.
And I can double tap on it.
4 3. Select Kamiko Q.
And I
Clark.
select that item.
Customers. Back button.
And I can move my finger above the labels.
Name. Address. City.
I'm moving it too fast.
Address.
And then I can go to the corresponding field, if I find it.
8 4 3. Text field is editing. 8 4 3 3 6 7 8. Luctus. Saint. Character mode. Insertion point between T and Luctus. Selected. Finished moving. Text field is editing. Luctus selected. Character mode.
If I put my finger on top of the star, white star.
Star. White star. Star.
So basically, this control right now is telling the system the contents of the label inside of the controller, which is star or white star. Star or white star. It doesn't tell a lot. It's not very useful from a usability point of view. It doesn't really tell me what this thing is. It's actually a favorite control. I would like the thing to tell me favorite, control, enable, disable, something like that, not star, white star. What is a star anyway in this context, right? So this is the idea. So right now I am going to start fixing the application little by little, but you can imagine that if I have to enable and disable all the time VoiceOver to test my app using VoiceOver is a bit cumbersome. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to, for the moment, I'm going
settings.
To disable VoiceOver.
On. VoiceOver off.
And I'm going to work on Xcode, and I'm going to use the simulator. Can you use the simulator for working on accessibility? Well, yes, you can, particularly because since Xcode 8, we have an accessibility inspector built in. And this is extremely useful. It's one of the best new features of Xcode 8 is the accessibility inspector. And this accessibility inspector is extremely simple. It consists of a simple screen with a selector. You can select what application to inspect. So in this case, I'm going to work on the simulator. It will make everything simpler. And it contains 3 major tabs or 3 major screens, which is the inspection screen, the audit screen, and the settings screen. There is also a small loop or target object that allows you to select different elements on the screen. So for example, if I want to inspect, and unfortunately the screen is not super big, but I can inspect my UI, clicking on the inspector button, and here I can see, if I select that object, what is the label that will be spoken by the voiceover system. This is exactly the text that was being spoken a couple of seconds ago when I was doing the demo, right? So as you can see, it's a bit too much. Can we do something about it? Well, yes, turns out that we can go to the master view controller, and here I can set the accessibility label for the cell. This is a very simple UI table view cell delegate and data source kind of code. I'm just getting a cell. The cell by default is accessible, but it will read anything that is inside of the labels. So here we just want the name of the customer to be shown. So if I relaunch my application now on the simulator, and I run again my accessibility inspector, now the name that appears will be, the name that will be spoken is only the main name of the customer. Of course, here we could put any kind of information. I could be more specific, saying customer, name, K. Friedman, and so on. It's up to you to choose whatever is perfect, whatever is best on your context. Then, another thing that the accessibility inspector allows you to do, and this is in the settings, it allows you to play with dynamic type. This is something that is very cumbersome to test in general in Xcode, because you have to go back to the settings, change the dynamic type settings, go back to your app and see how it all reacts. While right now, you can basically show it and change it live directly on the screen. Now, it almost works, and this is because UI table views are accessible by default. UI table views already, and their cells, and in this case I'm using stock controls like the UI table view cell by default. They are already accessible. They already provide a lot of accessibility features, including the support for dynamic text. Now, it is arguable that this is probably not the best user experience. I mean, we would like things to resize consistently, to display in a better way, right? So this is something that we can do as well. Here I have in my viewDidLoad method, and for some reason the uncomment feature has stopped working on my Xcode, and I don't know why, but that's how it goes. Yeah, Xcode 8 General Gold Master in front of you, ladies and gentlemen. So here, if you specify UI table view automatic dimension to the row height of your table view, and you provide the same to the section header height, this already solves this problem. And actually, these small changes work, I think, for maybe 80% of all iOS applications in the planet. And right now, if I go back to my accessibility inspector, and I select the settings panel, I can see that everything resizes wonderfully well. So this is a much, much better user experience. I have a very nice screen resizing as I move my sliders back and forth. So this is much, much better. So we have here a very nice master controller that actually works pretty well in terms of accessibility. Now, what about the form? The form is a little bit different, because to begin with, there's absolutely no support for dynamic text. Okay? So let us make that first. Let us make that change first. I'm going to go to my form view controller. And how does dynamic type work? Dynamic type works through notifications. And there's a particular notification that we are interested into listening to, which is the UI content size category did change. UI content size category did change. This is the notification that you want to listen to. And I have this dynamic type method that I have stopped right here. I'm going to uncomment up to here and this thing as well. So in dynamic type, in this method that will be executed every time I receive the dynamic type notification on my app, what do? I basically ask UIKit for the font that belongs to a particularly text style. And here you can see an enumeration of all the styles that are provided by Dynamics Text. These are the styles that you've seen on the table a couple of minutes ago. Okay? It's exactly that. You're just saying, okay, this text is body. Give me the font for that particular style. And you're just going, I'm just going to do something very, very simple. I am going through the IB outlet collections that I have in my project, all the labels, all the text fields. You just put the new font, and that's it, even on the Save button. This is very straightforward. So what happens when I run this app right now? If I go to my simulator, and I select an item on the list, I move around, and as you can see, my text grows naturally. Now, very important. First of all, you have to know that UI text field, the UI text field class does not change size. This is by design. This is the way they are. And you might want, depending on the amount of text that you're showing and the kind of experience you want to offer, you might want to use a UI text view instead of a UI text field, okay? Second, UI text fields constrain, you can constrain UI text fields to not grow the text beyond a certain growth. So basically the text will not grow beyond a certain size, okay, on display. And another important fact of this particular screen is that the text sizes, the text fields and the labels have a constraint on the baseline. So basically, when the baseline of one of the label goes down, the text field follows, and so on. Okay? So these constraints helps auto layout automatically recalculate the locations of your items on the screen as you change this, as you change the text. For those of you wondering about this little white thing that I'm showing right here, this circle of life that appears right there, this is not an accessibility feature. This is called Mouse Pose, and it's an application that should be running right there on top, but you cannot see it because there are so many things and the screen is a bit too small. So it's a commercial application. It's not an accessibility feature, but it's actually a very cool feature if you have to teach or do something on showing your Mac to somebody else. So we have fixed dynamic type, both on the master and the detail, so we're pretty happy about that. How about other things? Like, for example, there's this validation error. I don't really like it because my problem is the following. If I go to the system preferences of the Mac and I go to accessibility and I select zoom, display, use grayscale, and I see my screen on grayscale right now, and thankfully it also happens on the screen. Take a look right now at the contrast between the age field that has an error and the zip field that doesn't have. This is clearly not good in terms of accessibility. We are not conveying the idea that this field has a problem. Actually, there are 1,000 different ways. I've chosen very simple ones here, but it's just for you to get the idea that some people might not see the differences in hierarchy in your UI if you only use font color, okay? Hierarchy should be conveyed by other means. For example, bold text or even different text. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to keep my screen in grayscale. That will also be an interesting experience to see how some people who don't see colors might be experiencing macOS 10. And here I'm going to create a private constant called error prefix. I'm going to add this error prefix to every label that has a problem. And I am going to modify my show error and hide error method. So I have these two methods that are right here. I'm just going to select this. So now I am going to use a bold system font for the error. And if I'm showing the error, if the text is not already with the prefix, error prefix, I am going to add that error prefix to the text. Inversely, in my hide error method, I'm going to do exactly the opposite. In hide error, I am going to look for the prefix, and I'm going to remove it. So I'm going to take the substring from that index. It's a very simple, very naive implementation, but it might get the work done, which is mostly what I want in this context right now. So I go back to my simulator, and in my simulator right now, if I have an error, now I have something that looks a bit better on a gray screen, and it's a bit more telling. Still, it's not perfect. I would like also to add some kind of error message to the whole thing. So I have here, actually I have added already to this project an error label that for the moment has been hidden. You haven't seen it. And the error label, what I'm going to do is to basically simply calculate if there are errors. I'm going to do only up to this. There we go. This is what I want. As you can see, there are other things that will come in the demo in a couple of minutes. So what is this errors variable? Well, it's something that I initiate to 0, and I increment that errors variable every time a field has no text. Very simple, very naive implementation, once again. If I relaunch my application, I drive inside of one of my items, and now I have a much more meaningful error appearing there. So it already gives me a bit more context and a bit more information. Another thing is that I don't like is that the H field displays this kind of keyboard. This is an easy change. We can go very simply to the zip file that contains the form of my screen. So this is a zip file. I've separated the UI of the form out of the storyboard. This is a trick that I always do. It helps me maintain my UI in different files. And it's something as well that there's going to be a session about tricks of storyboards that Joe is going to give. So I strongly recommend that you check it out as well, because don't fall into the trap of the magnified storyboard for your app, because it's a problem. So I'm going to select the H field, and very simple, I'm going to go to the properties of that. I'm going to change that keyboard to be number pad. This is usability. Remember that accessibility is not only about usability, but it also plays an important role. Very good. So this was a very small change. Now, another concern that I have is to see how all of this works in terms of the accessibility inspector. So for example, if I go to my accessibility inspector and I select any of these fields, well, actually I see that there's no label, there's no accessibility label, and the only thing that I get is the value of the value of the text field, which is okay, but I would like to have some kind of contextual information telling me what kind of field am I actually looking at. This is something that can be done very, very simple on Xcode, and it's better when you have a big screen. This will be a little bit confusing, maybe. I hope not. And now I've made it too big. There we go. So I am going to go to the identity inspector. I never remember the names of these guys. I always have to go like, and now I'm going to the identity inspector and to the attributes inspector. I never remember the names of these sub guys. And here, once you've selected the name, you can put label, customer name field. In the address, you can do the same. I will not do all of them because you get the idea. Add customer address field. And if I relaunch my app, you get the idea. You're going to have on the accessibility inspector the required information. And here, if I select that thing, you've got that information appearing right there. Very simple. Of course, as you can see, this workflow is much faster than actually enabling VoiceOver, going to your application, putting in your finger, checking what it said. This allows you for a much smoother workflow, in my opinion. We could go back to colors, if you don't mind, because I like colors, and basically we've already solved the contrast problem that we had in our application. Now, the last bit that I still see as a problem is the following. What happens if you are a blind user and you have an empty field? The blind user will not be notified of the fact that there is an error that says error fields cannot be empty. So I just came up, I asked myself that question preparing this session. There are 1,000 different ways to do this, but I've prepared a very simple one, which is using the speech synthesizer of iOS. So I'm going back, I'm going to hide this guy, I'm going to go back to my form view controller code, and inside of my code I'm going to use Audio Toolbox and AV Foundation, which are the frameworks of where you can find the speech synthesizer. And I am going to, if there are more errors than 0, first of all I'm going to vibrate. I'm going to vibrate the device, and I'm going to check whether VoiceOver is running. This is a very interesting thing. If VoiceOver is running, then get the text of the error label and speak it. Very simple. Now, how do you get an information whether VoiceOver is running or not? I'm going to the top of my controller and I scroll down, and here I see that I have a Boolean variable that is the result of calling UI accessibility UI's VoiceOver is running. So this is cool. It provides you an imperative way of asking the operating system, hey, is VoiceOver running or not? But you might want to be notified whether VoiceOver will be running or not during the runtime of your application as well. So there's another notification that you can listen to, which is right here, is the UI accessibility VoiceOver status changed. It speaks very well what it does. So I'm going to enable a little bit of code that I have commented out at the bottom of my project. So here I have my VoiceOver status notification. So basically, the VoiceOver status notification does not bring the information whether VoiceOver is on or not. You have to actually go and check out again using the UI accessibility's VoiceOver running function to get that information. But still, it's very helpful. So if VoiceOver is running, then at some point in time, I might want to vibrate. The vibration code is the usual code that you can find on Stack Overflow. That's where I found this code. And this is the speak text. So here I'm using a little bit of asynchronous programming, which Joe has shown a little bit a couple of minutes ago. This is Swift 3. So by the way, this is how dispatch queues call looks in Swift 3. I'm just executing on the main thread after 1 second a little bit of code that creates an utterance, a speech synthesis voice, and then I create a speech synthesizer and I speak that utterance with that voice. Very simple. It's a very, very simple call. So I am going to execute this application now on my device so you can hear what is the final result of making all of these changes. Oh, one thing before I forget, I would like to go to my favorite controls. This is the favorite control that you've seen that displays a star or an empty star depending on the status of the control. It's a very simple control, and then it triggers the associated IB action. It's a very, very simple thing. Now, here I want to enable some accessibility information. So in my init with frame and init with coder, I will call an init accessibility function that I've created right here that is shared between both, that sets the answers to the questions asked by the UI accessibility protocol. Basically, I'm telling that the element yes, it is enabled, and that it's a button, and that the label is favorite, and the accessibility value is not a favorite customer by default. But of course, I'm changing that value depending on whether whether the component is on or off. It's a very simple working. As you can see, it's not even 100 lines of code, all included. So this is my custom control. I'm going to run this whole thing right now on my device, on the Akosma, which is this thing. So I'm going to enable it. I'm going to show QuickTime, which shows the current state of my app right now. And here I'm going to run the application on my device. So here I hide everything. Let's put this in full screen so it's better for everyone. There we go. And I'm going to, there we go. The application is running. Xcode, as you can see, is running, so everybody is happy. I'm going back to the settings, and I'm going to enable VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on. Settings. Accessibility. Back button.
So our friend is back, so we can start using the app. So right now, I'm going to go to the application.
VoiceOver. Accessible. Active.
I double tap on it.
Swipe up with free. Accessible. Customers. Heading. Zeus Weiss. Jameson Pacheco.
As you can see, it only speaks the first label and not the rest. So I'm going to select Jameson Pacheco because I love the name Jameson Pacheco. This is sample data.
Select it. Jameson Pacheco. Customers. Back button.
This is a sample data that I got from datagenerator.org or something like that, which is very useful, and it generates data in a plethora of formats. And I'm going to go to the age field.
56. Text field.
The age field did not have the change that we made previously, so I'm going to show
customer address field.
There we go.
9671 Agesta Save. Text field. 56. Text field. 56. 56. Text field. Text
I double
field
tap on it.
Is editing. 56. Character mode. Insertion point at end. 6.
I delete
5
items, and now I jump to another form field to trigger the error.
97709. Insertion point at end.
And there should be a voice.
Text field. Insertion point at end. Insertion customer address field. 9006 insertion point at end.
And something, I must have forgotten something or recompiling or something, because there should be the voice after 1 second saying error, field not be empty. I probably forgot to uncomment something, so I'm just going to check very quickly. So let me see if there's anything. No, there's nothing that I forgot to uncomment. So clearly there's something wrong. But this is the God demos. You should have heard the voice of the speech synthesizer telling us that there was an error. So there you go. A very simple walkthrough over different accessibility.
Character mode. Insertion point at end.
I will disconnect that if you don't mind.
App switcher. Settings. VoiceOver. VoiceOver off.
Thank you. There you go. So that was a simple demo about some of these accessibility features. There's a lot more than you can do, but this is what I could fit in the time of a session. And I think these are particularly important and particularly simple to do. And I haven't shown the fact that you can run UI tests. I'm more than happy to show you the code as well. You can use UI tests. Well, I can show that very quickly because it just came to my mind that we have. If I go to my accessible UI tests, there we go. In my accessible UI test right here, I'm using the accessibility favorite value to find the button on the UI and to trigger its associated action. So this is the last thing that I wanted to show. This code will be published on GitHub as well, so I'm going to just put that as well there for those of you who would like to know. Some simple guidelines before we finish. Add always the scripted text in your UI controls. This helps a lot for accessibility. Make the input in your UIs as simple as possible because it's quite cumbersome even for users without disabilities. It is a good thing. Avoid scrolling. As you can see, you can scroll over using VoiceOver. You can scroll with 3 fingers, but it's quite cumbersome. It is much better for accessibility if your data fits in one screenful of information. And very important, number 4, do not rely on gestures alone. Make things obvious. Put buttons that explain the actions of your applications. Many apps are very fancy and they use gestures with 4 fingers to trigger things. For me, I think it's a bit of a problem. Even for elderly people, it's kind of complicated to find their way. Finally, a call to action. There we go. The call to action that I was talking about at the very beginning. Please add accessibility to your applications, because accessibility is about empathy. Whenever you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and you try to understand their situations and you say, I understand you and I want to help you, that empathy, as a developer, you can do it through accessibility. And very important, Accessible India. There was a tweet by Saltmarch a couple of days ago talking about Accessible India. So I think it's very important. You live in a country with so many cultures and so many different possibilities of dealing with the other person, that I think is a very important thing that we take care as app developers, the opportunity to make the world a better place through accessibility. I will leave you with a quote by Helen Keller. Science may have found a cure for most evils, but it has found no remedy for the worst of them all, the apathy of human beings. So, against apathy and for empathy, I leave you. Please make your apps accessible. Thank you so much.